Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes $14 billion aid to Israel bill passes U.S. House of Representatives. You just gaslit her. How Dean Phillips' first town hall went off the rails in NH. House GOP targets IRS in bill to provide emergency aid to Israel. Does the new House Speaker really think the Biden impeachment push is apolitical? Democratic lawmaker Phillips loaning his campaign $2 million against Biden. $14 billion aid to Israel bill passes U.S. House of Representatives. Financial Times. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed legislation to provide $14 billion in aid to Israel. However, the bill faces opposition from the White House and Senate due to its failure to fund other foreign policy priorities, such as Ukraine. The bill also includes a measure that cuts funding for the Internal Revenue Service's crackdown on tax avoidance, making it particularly unpopular with Democrats. The White House has stated that President Joe Biden would veto the bill, as it represents only a small portion of the funding package he demanded last month. The bill passed with mostly Republican support, but 12 Democrats voted in favor while 2 Republicans opposed it. You just gaslit her. How Dean Phillips' first town hall went off the rails in NH. Washington Post. Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips, who is challenging Joe Biden in the Democratic primary, faced backlash from voters at his first town hall event. The event saw screaming and profanity from attendees disappointed with Phillips' response to a question on a ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza conflict. The tense moment reflects the impassioned debate within the Democratic Party over the war and questions who exactly Phillips hopes to appeal to. Phillips' campaign has already faced criticism for being a late and little-known entrant to the presidential race. Phillips' crowd at the event was small and largely made up of staff, family, and friends. The event was unconventional, with attendees entering through a metal detector and having their bags checked. Security staff were noticeable around the room during the town hall. A deep security staff is typically only employed by Biden and Donald Trump, who both have Secret Service protection. Phillips' campaign also had a large number of photographers and videographers present at the event. A woman at the event asked Phillips to support a ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza conflict. Phillips responded by turning the question back on the woman, asking how she felt about Israelis killed by Hamas in the conflict. He did not answer her follow-up questions on why he is not calling for a ceasefire. The event devolved into a shouting match, with attendees accusing Phillips of not caring about Palestinian children and walking out. Phillips later defended his response, saying he supports a ceasefire when Hamas is no longer in a position to murder Israelis. House GOP targets IRS in bill to provide emergency aid to Israel. Associated Press. House Republicans have proposed a bill to cut $14 billion from the IRS in exchange for providing aid to Israel, a move that has been criticized by independent budget analysts. The Congressional Budget Office has stated that this would actually cost taxpayers billions of dollars and result in a net increase in the deficit of $12.5 billion. The IRS is responsible for auditing the wealthy, which brings in more money than it costs. Cutting the funding would reduce the amount of money the IRS can collect and return to the Treasury. Does the new House Speaker really think the Biden impeachment push is apolitical? Washington Post. 10 days ago, it didn't really matter what Representative Mike Johnson, Republican Louisiana, thought about his party's impeachment inquiry into President Biden. It had been announced by Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican California, in September and yielded one hearing later that month, a hearing that, by most objective, and some subjective, accounts ended up mostly embarrassing the congressional leaders responsible for running it. Democratic lawmaker Phillips loaning his campaign $2 million against Biden. Yahoo! U.S. Representative Dean Phillips is loaning his campaign about $2 million to fund his bid to challenge President Joe Biden for the Democratic presidential nomination. Phillips, a 3-term congressman from Minnesota, said he would not take money from lobbyists and would not seek outside fundraising groups working on his behalf. He also said he would attend fundraisers with big-dollar individual donors who can give a maximum of $3,300 in the presidential primary fight. Chile's Boric, after condemning Israel over Gaza, raises concerns with Biden. Reuters. Chilean President Gabriel Boric has condemned the Israeli military's air bombardment of Gaza and accused them of violating international law. Boric also called for the release of Israeli hostages, but stated that Israel's retaliatory bombardment of Gaza had been disproportionate. He made these comments after a meeting with President Joe Biden at the White House, but did not disclose Biden's response to his remarks. Boric also discussed efforts to safeguard democracy in Latin America and called on Biden to lift sanctions on Cuba and remove it from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. The two leaders also discussed strengthening ties between Chile and the U.S., focusing on topics such as the green transition, migration, and economic development. Israeli troops encircle Gaza City as global criticism of strikes mounts. New York Times. The Israeli military has announced that ground troops have completely encircled Gaza City, as criticism mounts over the death toll from Israeli airstrikes. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the bombing campaign could be a war crime, whilst the UN Agency for Children, UNICEF, has described the aftermath of the strikes as horrific and appalling. The U.S. has called for Israel to periodically pause its military campaign on humanitarian grounds, but has so far resisted making a similar call for a ceasefire. Israeli officials have defended their conduct of the war, with one spokesman claiming that the entire responsibility lies on the terrorists of Hamas. In total, Israeli strikes in Gaza have killed over 9,000 people, according to Gazan health officials, with at least a quarter of all buildings in northern Gaza damaged or destroyed. The UN has said that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is becoming more acute, with the UN Agency for Palestinians running out of fuel, water, food and medicine. Israel says it has Gaza City surrounded. South China Morning Post. Israel has surrounded Gaza City after a deadly fire by the Palestinian territory on October 7. The Ezzeddin al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, has warned Israel that if they invade, soldiers would go home in black bags. The Israeli military spokesman says troops had completely surrounded Gaza City after days of expanding ground operations. The military spokesman also said that the concept of a ceasefire is not currently on the table at all. Israel and Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon exchanged fire after rockets slammed into a northern Israel town. The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has said he would work to avoid escalation of the Israel-Gaza war. On October 9, hundreds of foreigners and dual nationals managed to escape war-torn Gaza for Egypt as Israel's forces bombarded and fought ground battles in the besieged territory. Egypt plans to help evacuate 7,000 foreigners through the Rafah crossing with the Gaza Strip. The president's man with $1.2 trillion and an infrastructure plan to sell. Bloomberg. Only 38% of swing state voters trust President Joe Biden to handle infrastructure, according to a Bloomberg/Morning Consult poll. In contrast, 42% of voters trust former President Donald Trump, who had promised a major infrastructure program while in office but never delivered. Mitch Landrieu, the White House infrastructure coordinator, is responsible for coordinating the implementation of the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package. While there are currently 38,000 projects in the pipeline, critics argue that $1.2 trillion is not enough, especially if Republicans manage to cut the budgets of infrastructure agencies. Dozens of U.S. citizens depart Gaza as Israel presses offensive. Washington Post. Injured Palestinians and foreign passport holders were able to leave the Gaza Strip for Egypt for a second day on Thursday, including some of the hundreds of American citizens the Biden administration has been trying to extricate for weeks. Australia's Prime Minister embarks on state visit to China after trade thaw. Financial Times. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is embarking on a state visit to China to repair relations between the two countries after a period of tension. This marks a dramatic turnaround in relations, which had deteriorated over trade and security issues. Beijing had imposed tariffs and sanctions on Australian goods and detained Australian citizens, while Canberra called for investigations into Chinese political influence and the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. The recent rapprochement has been driven by weariness among businesses with trade tensions and a desire to move away from the more hostile stance of Albanese's predecessor. However, Albanese faces the challenge of repairing relations with China, while also forging closer security ties with the US to counter Beijing's influence in the region. Albanese's trip to China comes after a visit to Washington last month, where he highlighted the need for Australia to have a clear-eyed approach to its relationship with China. The visit will include meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang, and may result in announcements on areas of cooperation such as green energy and climate change. Senate confirms 3 more senior military officers around Tuberville blockade. Washington Post. The U.S. Senate has confirmed 3 senior military officers in defiance of a blockade imposed by Senator Tommy Tuberville, who has been seeking to gain leverage in his bid over Pentagon travel policy regarding troops seeking abortions. The confirmation of the officers, including the first woman to be appointed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, follows mounting frustration among fellow Republicans and concerns that Tuberville's actions may undermine U.S. military readiness at a time when wars are ongoing in the Middle East and Ukraine. Evacuations to Egypt continue as Israeli troops surround Gaza City, full coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. Yahoo! Israel Defense Forces, IDF, spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari announced that Israeli troops have completed an encirclement around Gaza City as the ground assault continues. Calls for a ceasefire are growing louder as civilian deaths mount and the humanitarian crisis worsens. However, Israel has so far rejected such calls in its response to the Hamas attack on October 7 that killed over 1,400 people. More than 8,800 people, including thousands of children, have been killed in retaliatory strikes across the Gaza Strip. President Biden suggested a humanitarian pause on Wednesday, as limited evacuations into Egypt began through the Rafah border crossing. U.S. citizens were among the first to leave the besieged enclave, along with other foreign nationals and injured Palestinians. Another 400 American nationals were approved to leave Gaza on Thursday. In addition to this, Lebanon's Hezbollah said it had attacked Israeli army positions using explosive drones for the first time, prompting heavy Israeli shelling in an escalation of more than 3 weeks of clashes at the frontier. The Israeli army said it was striking a series of Hezbollah targets in Lebanon following a number of launches towards Israel. Lebanon's national news agency reported Israeli shells hitting various areas of the south along the border. Furthermore, Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke to reporters on Thursday before departing for Israel, where he said he plans to talk to Israeli officials about concrete steps that can be taken to minimize harm to civilians in Gaza who are caught in a crossfire of Hamas's making. A year from 2024 election, Biden's strategy memo says he'll revive 2020 themes, draw contrast to Trump. Associated Press. President Joe Biden's re-election campaign intends to frame the 2024 presidential race around themes that were successful in 2020. Biden's campaign manager, Julie Chavez Rodriguez, stated that the message Biden ran on in 2020 remains popular with voters and central to this campaign. The memo obtained by the Associated Press reflects a president who is asking voters to allow him to finish the job while focusing on presenting the race as a referendum on stopping Trump. Although national polls indicate that, if the race were held today, a rematch between Biden and Trump would be close, the memo argues that the MAGA movement is a significant barrier to victory for the GOP in key battleground states. Biden's campaign has started a $25 million advertising campaign targeting voters across battleground states, with efforts to reinforce Biden's record, particularly on the economy, and remind voters of the reeling pandemic economy he inherited in 2021 and where things are now. However, polls show that only about 40% of U.S. adults approve of the president's job performance, and 2/3 disapprove of his handling of the economy. U.S. to award up to $440 million for Puerto Rico rooftop solar power. Reuters. The Biden administration is initiating discussions with solar energy companies and nonprofit groups in Puerto Rico regarding the allocation of up to $440 million for rooftop solar and battery storage systems. These funds are part of a $1 billion package included in recent legislation to enhance energy resilience for Puerto Rico's most vulnerable households and communities. The goal is to assist Puerto Rico in achieving its target of 100% renewable energy by 2050. The Department of Energy is engaging with companies such as Generac Power Systems, Sonova Energy, and Suanruan, which could receive a total of $400 million to deploy residential solar and battery systems. Nonprofits and cooperatives, including Barrio Electrico and the Environmental Defense Fund, may be granted $40 million. The installation of rooftop solar and battery storage systems can enhance independence from the centralized grid while reducing emissions. The devastation caused by Hurricane Maria in 2017 resulted in the loss of thousands of lives and highlighted the vulnerability of Puerto Rico's power grid, particularly in communities with elderly and low-income individuals. Weaker storms in subsequent years have further emphasized the need for a more resilient and sustainable energy infrastructure. Hunter Biden says his addiction used as disinformation against father. Reuters. Hunter Biden has accused Republicans of launching a vile and sustained disinformation campaign against his father, U.S. President Joe Biden, ahead of the 2024 election. In an op-ed for USA Today, Hunter Biden claimed his past substance abuse issues had been used in a campaign to damage the president's reputation. Hunter Biden has also been charged with lying on a federal form to get a handgun in 2018, and with being an illegal drug user in possession of a weapon. He has pleaded not guilty. His case is the first-ever criminal prosecution of a sitting U.S. president's child. U.S. should shed China fantasies ahead of Biden-Xi summit at APEC. Nikkei Asia. The U.S. should bid farewell to illusions and face the reality of China's stance on global issues, according to Katsuji Nakazawa, a former correspondent for the Nikkei Asian Review. Nakazawa argues that it is unrealistic to expect China to take a stand on behalf of the U.S. on crucial global issues, such as the Middle East. He also highlights that China has been using any means possible to undermine the U.S. in the global South. Nakazawa suggests that the upcoming summit between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping could provide insight into whether China has the willingness or ability to genuinely cooperate with the U.S. Nakazawa also notes that China has moved away from the path of reform and opening up, with President Xi consolidating more power into his own hands. The author concludes that it is important for leaders of both countries to meet and understand each other's thought processes, as China has very different governance and decision-making structures. How Australia should manage the China conundrum. Bloomberg. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is set to visit China for the first time in 7 years. The trip comes as Australia and China aim to stabilize relations amid rising tensions. Australia has successfully reset its relationship with China, and Albanese should use this opportunity to make strong demands and seek more give and take in the bilateral relationship. He should raise the case of Australian writer Yang Hengjuan, stress the importance of upholding international maritime conventions in the South China Sea, and address the issue of Taiwan. The trip is an opportunity to further strengthen ties between the two countries. Israel aid bill in House sets up clash with Biden and Senate. New York Times. The U.S. House of Representatives defied President Biden's veto threat and bipartisan opposition in the Senate by passing a $14.3 billion aid package for Israel in its war with Hamas. The bill aims to condition military funding for Israel on slashing the same amount for a tax enforcement initiative at the Internal Revenue Service. President Biden requested a package totaling $105 billion to include aid for Israel and Ukraine and humanitarian aid to Gaza, but House Republicans said it was important to pass aid to Israel without delay and in a fiscally responsible manner. The bill is set for a bipartisan bloc of opposition in the Senate, where lawmakers favor packaging aid for Israel with money to help Ukraine fend off Russia's invasion, as well as for other global crises. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced that the Senate would not take up the House-passed proposal at all, and would instead craft its own bipartisan bill containing aid for Israel and Ukraine, and humanitarian aid to Gaza. 12 Democrats join Republicans to strip IRS funding to support Israel. The Independent. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed a $14.3 billion aid package for Israel, but the bill is likely to be vetoed by President Joe Biden. The bill would divert funds from the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, intended for tax enforcement to provide aid to Israel. The bill passed with support from 12 Democrats and the Republican majority, despite the typically bipartisan support for aid to Israel. The proposed legislation is not expected to pass in the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said that the Senate will develop its own bipartisan emergency aid package that includes aid for Ukraine, Israel, competition with China, and humanitarian aid for Gaza. Well, folks, it's been quite a week in the world of politics. From the U.S. House of Representatives passing a $14 billion aid package to Israel, to the tense town hall meeting for Congressman Dean Phillips, there's been no shortage of drama. Let's start with the aid package to Israel. This bill faces opposition from the White House and Senate due to its failure to fund other foreign policy priorities, such as Ukraine. Not to mention, it includes a measure that cuts funding for the IRS's crackdown on tax avoidance, making it unpopular with Democrats. President Biden has stated that he would veto the bill, as it represents only a small portion of the funding package he demanded last month. So it seems like this bill has a long way to go before becoming law. Speaking of drama, Congressman Dean Phillips faced a heated town hall event where attendees were disappointed with his response to a question on the Israel-Gaza conflict. The event quickly devolved into a shouting match, with attendees accusing Phillips of not caring about Palestinian children. It's clear that the debate within the Democratic Party over this issue is passionate and divisive. In other news, the House Republicans' proposal to cut $14 billion from the IRS in exchange for providing aid to Israel has faced criticism from budget analysts. The Congressional Budget Office has stated that this would cost taxpayers billions of dollars and increase the deficit. It's a classic case of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and it's not a popular move. And let's not forget about Hunter Biden, who has accused Republicans of launching a vile and sustained disinformation campaign against his father, President Joe Biden. In an op-ed, Hunter claims that his past substance abuse issues have been used to damage his father's reputation. It's a reminder that politics can be a dirty game, and family members are not immune to attacks. Overall, it's been a week of contentious debates, political maneuvering, and personal attacks. The world of politics is never dull, that's for sure. So, what are your thoughts on these stories? Do you agree with the aid package to Israel? How do you feel about the town hall meeting with Congressman Phillips? Let's hear your thoughts. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.